Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is the desktop lecture for Chapter 18, which is called The Unsettled World, 1890 through 1914, and that 1914 date is important because World War I is going to start here in the next chapter. So I think that's why historians like to use that cutoff date. But for large part, this chapter is a continuation of some of the themes we saw in Chapter 17. So Chapter 17 and a little bit of Chapter 16, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and sort of the ascendancy of industrial capitalism and some of the effects that that had on society and culture. And so we know Europe is changing, and we know people are beginning to urbanize to some extent in the Western world as manufacturing takes hold, and the agrarian lifestyle starts to fade. So there are changes going on in society due to the economy, and there are also changes going on in societies because of vast movements of population. So one of the things you'll read about in this chapter is immigration happening all over. And if you look at pages 672 and 673, there's a pretty good map that shows you the extent of immigration, especially in the U.S. in the late 1800s. There was, a lot of immigration from Europe. My grandparents, for example, came from Europe. Probably some of your great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents came in that wave. So immigration was a big thing, and not only in the U.S. but worldwide. So what that also meant was there were social changes from immigration, from people from different cultures assimilating, and just a lot of social changes going on. So one of the big things out of this chapter in the late 1800s is immigration and vast population movements. The other thing in really the non-Western world is this reactions against colonial domination. So in the last chapter, we talked about colonialism and we talked about imperialism. We looked at examples such as India with the British taking over, and we talked about, or we read about, Japan taking over Korea. So also Africa being colonized. So these countries that were under colonial rule, there are a lot of revolts in these countries. So that's continuing, and a continuing theme from Chapter 17. But again, just like immigration and industrialization are themes in this chapter, this notion of hatred of colonial domination is a theme as well. And obviously the world's going to be upset pretty soon with the onslaught of World War I, but it's important to understand that there is dissatisfaction amongst colonial subjects. There's dissatisfaction amongst workers, and they're also at the same time, these modern economies, the creation of banks and federal reserves, for example, all of a sudden we see a lot of boom and bust. In other words, we see depressions and recessions, although they called them panics back then. But we start to see the economy that's very much like the modern economy, where people are under risk always of losing money or banks going broke, that sort of thing. So all of these are factors probably best characterized as just plain change. And when there's change, there's always rebellion and revolution and social change. So that's kind of what's going on in this chapter. In Europe, certainly the last time we looked at a European map, it didn't look anything like the European map today. I've just lost my place on my document, so I'm scrolling as we go. But there's lots of changes in the European map. So with the unification of Germany and Italy, all of a sudden this notion of nation, which we talked about before, is strained and realigned. So that's another thing besides industrialization that is happening to change societies. And certainly that's the case in Europe. And I'm still scrolling through my notes, so bear with me for a minute. So one of the things the book's going to talk about that I don't need my notes for is the notion of cultural modernism. And really that's just sort of a fancy word of saying that modern art and different forms of literature are starting to be seen in the late 1800s. So probably the most classic example would be Picasso, who's starting to paint back then, and this modernism is reflected in his art. It's reflected in music, the music of Schopenhauer, for example, and then also the book talks about new science. So the book talks a lot about Einstein and sort of this beginning of modern physics, which we know is going to change everything as well. So as I get back to my notes, let's see where we're at. Okay. So modernism is something you want to pay attention to. The thing that amazes me about the textbook, which always tells you sometimes historians and textbooks miss big things, is that they make a big deal out of Sigmund Freud and they make a big deal out of Picasso in the book, but they don't mention Louis Pasteur and the discovery of germ theory, which between Pasteur and a guy named Koch, Robert Koch, they're not in the textbook at all. And arguably, I would say, as a technology or a discovery, that the discovery of germ theory is probably one of the most important discoveries in the history of mankind as far as saving lives is concerned. But the book doesn't mention it. But I want you to know about it, so that's something that is in my reading notes. I'll put on the quiz. We want to talk about germ theory. So at least understand that germ theory, the discovery of germs or pathogens as a cause of illness, is discovered in the late 1800s, and I think it's a really big deal. So there's that. It's in my reading notes. Also on pages 696 and 697, make a mental note of. There's a paragraph in there called restricting immigration. And, it strikes me as I read it, this is still going on today. So it's not just the U.S., but immigration restrictions in Europe are also going on at the same time. And I think it's just reflective of this continued fear of the other. So, race is still a huge issue. So think about the United States, even after the Civil War in this time period, segregation, is Jim Crow. So, I mean, it's a huge issue, not only in the U.S., but it's also an issue in Europe. And as these new European nations form, many of them are very homogenous and very insular. So, they're not allowing immigrants in at all. And so this idea of restrictions in immigration is going on all the time. And certainly it's still going on today. We see it in the news all the time. The other thing I want to mention, because I think it fits in with this idea of fear of the other, or Western cultures kind of looking down on Asian cultures or even Islam. There's an interesting thing in the book that I kind of like. So they're talking about Einstein and his work in the late 1800s, but it mentions that Einstein based all of his work on a scholar, a physicist from India. And so that's Nath Bose. So no one ever hears about this guy Bose, and his theories were ridiculed in the West until Einstein started to look into his theories, and they were the basis for Einstein's theory of relativity. So again, you can see even in our textbook how the European or the American inventor or discoverer is highlighted, where in the case of Einstein, he originally got his ideas from Bose, who was an Indian, and Bose is never mentioned in any of the textbooks, probably because he's not European or American. So keep that in mind. It's sort of the way that we construct meaning about other people through the text that we read, and also what we miss when we only look at one source of information. So that's it for Chapter 18. Everyone's doing a great job. Be safe, and I'll see you again next week. Take care.